Okay, we should be live.
Okay, good. Great, thanks. Thanks everybody for being here. We'll get this meeting started today at 3:02 p.m. And what I'd like to do is a quick roll call here. Member Vitale.
Here.
Member Lyford.
Here.
Member Kenny.
Here.
Member Cervantes.
Here.
And I am here, Trustee Andrews. Thanks, everybody. On 2B, is there any reordering of agenda items that anybody would like to do? It's a pretty short agenda today, so I don't imagine there is, but let me know. And if not, hearing none, I think we move on to the adoption of the agenda. So can I get a motion to adopt today's agenda?
I move to adopt.
I second.
Second, okay, and we'll take a roll call, a verbal roll call. Member Vitale,
Yes.
Member Lyford,
Yes.
Member Kenny,
Yes.
Member Cervantes,
Aye.
and I vote yes as well, Terry Andrews. Diego, do we have any public comment on non-agenda items?
We currently do not, but I will check one more time and keep a look at that.
Okay.
Not so far.
Okay, thanks, Diego, for checking. All right, with that in mind, we go to the consent calendar, which we're approving the minutes from the last two meetings. So Rushmore has already asked to abstain from the meeting held on the 15th of June. He was not there. And I think that if we apply that rule, then we need to be selective, I think, on who votes for the May 25th meeting as well. So I'm going to break these into two different approvals. And the first thing I'd like to do, unless our questions or changes, is for a motion to approve the minutes from the special meeting that was held on May the 20th.
I'll move.
Okay, is there a second?
Second.
Okay. Maybe selective here in my, who were the folks that were present at that meeting on the 25th? I know I was.
I was.
Okay, it's two. I think Jim, you might have been gone. That might have been the only one. So I'll ask you to abstain on this particular vote.
Yes.
So if there is no questions on that set of minutes, I'd like to go ahead and get a vote for approving the minutes that were held on May the 25th. So I'll start with you, Member Lyford,
Aye.
Member Kenny,
Yes.
Member Cervantes,
Aye.
and I vote aye as well. Thank you for that. And now I'd like to get a second motion for the approval of the minutes that were held on June the 15th, again with an edited response.
Move the minutes from June 15th.
Okay, a second.
A second.
Okay, good. Let me get a vote for that then, and I think it would be Member Lyford,
Aye.
Member Kenny,
Yes.
and I was there, Terry Andrews, I vote aye as well. And thank you everybody for being so patient as we unwind all of our duties, our formal duties, and doing all those motions at the beginning of the meeting. I appreciate that. Today's meeting will actually be pretty brief, I believe, not really long. We've got a presentation from Doug Anderson, and we've also got some new business that will take a vote toward the end of the session. It's an important meeting in my mind for those of you that have read the documents that we're about to recommend to the full board. And we really are in sort of the fast lane, it seems to me, in terms of getting things rolling for the formation and the execution of the CFD. And with that in mind, I'm going to turn this over to Nikki. Nikki, do you have any comments? And you can also introduce Doug on the presentation that's coming up.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon. Afternoon.
Hi.
Yeah, happy Wednesday. So I am very excited to introduce Doug Anderson, our municipal advisor that works with Urban Futures. Doug and I started working together back in June, I think, Doug. And I just have to say, he's been an absolute joy to work with, very responsive. We definitely did an excellent job in selecting Urban Futures as our municipal advising firm. He's really taken the lead on helping us fill the rest of those consultant spots, including our bond underwriter and CFD administration firm, and has really taken the lead, which I can't tell you how much I appreciate with the many, many hats I seem to be wearing as library director and embarking on building renovation projects. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Doug. And just so everybody knows, Nora O'Brien, our bond counsel, will be joining us in a bit too as well. So thank you, Doug. Here you go.
Great. Thank you, Nikki, and thank you for those kind words. We certainly appreciate the opportunity to work with the district, and we're excited about this project. It's different for us. Typically, when we work on community facilities district issues, they're for a residential development that may be building out, usually in the outer regions of the Southland and Menifee and Lake Elsinore, places like that. So this is exciting for the library district. We have a presentation that I want to go over and talk about the bond issuance process. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Hang on one second. Okay. All right, can everybody see that?
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay, great. Okay, so CFD bond issuance process, and this is just some highlights, and you can certainly ask questions as we go along, but we're going to kind of go over the process, which we've already started, as you know, but we'll dig down and go into a little more detail here. So today we'll talk about the district fundamentals, the finance team members and some of their roles, the bond issuance procedures to actually issue the bonds. And then after the bonds are issued, we'll kind of highlight some of the CFD administration that will need to take place after the bonds are issued and specifically for the bond issue, as well as annual reporting requirements for the bond issue. I know you're all familiar with the CFD, but we'll hit on the highlights again. What is a CFD? It's a specific geographic area that levies a special tax, and that's in addition to regular property taxes. It's designed to be self-sufficient, so the administrative expenses are actually paid by the taxpayers as well. And the CFD may issue debt in the form of bonds supported by the special taxes. Of course, when you formed your CFD last year, there was a resolution of intention to issue bonds, which paves the way for the bond issue. It doesn't authorize you to issue specific bonds. That's what we're doing now. And there will be further resolutions and documents that will be specific to this bond issue. Within the CFD formation documents, there was a rate and method of apportionment, and that's sort of the controlling document that talks about the methodology to calculate the special taxes. In your case, there were several different categories of property owners. There was also an allowance for exemption for very low income residents. The rate and method describes all of that that's specific to your district. So we work with that, and your special tax consultant will work with that to generate projections of the revenue based on last year's collections. CFDs can be categorized into two types, facilities and services. Your CFD has both. The facilities portion obviously will pay for the new improvements that we're talking about for the libraries. The services component will kick in, I think, in a couple of years here after your current partial tax drops off. And so those are kind of two separate revenue sources. For your information, we do not bond against the services revenue. We're only bonding against the facilities revenue. So that's what we're using to support the bond issue.
Doug, this is Kim. I had a question on this slide.
Yes.
The rate and method of apportionment, is that in what was passed by voters, or is that a document that the library board can adjust if it needs to change?
I think it would have been shared with the voters as part of the package that they would have looked at in order to make a decision on the vote. And it certainly was approved by your board.
Well, so does that, I guess what I'm trying to get at, can it be changed without going back to the voters? That's what I wasn't clear on.
Oh, that's a legal question. I'm not sure. I would doubt it because
Okay,
it's
just,
pretty much set in stone.
right, yeah, I just wasn't sure exactly where it lived. Thanks.
Yeah,
Doug?
it's something that again, we're going to rely on that to generate the revenues for the bond issue. So certainly after we issue bonds, I would bet that you can't make any changes to that.
Doug, you indicated that facilities and services are of two types. And yet in the document that was sent to us under the facilities budget or the facilities bond of $24 million, that also is inclusive not only of hard costs, but of soft costs. How do you distinguish between soft cost services relative to facilities versus the services which you indicated are ongoing after completion of the project?
So the bond issue can pay for obviously hard improvements. It can also pay for development costs as you're gearing up, so engineering studies, things like that. But what it can't pay for, and what tax exempt bonds can't pay for in general as a federal law, is ongoing maintenance expenses. So we have to finance, in order to keep this a tax exempt bond issue, we have to finance improvements that will last at least 5 years. So to finance administration costs or maintenance costs, that won't fall into our category of things that we can finance with our tax exempt bond issue.
Okay, and as far as the amount of the bond, if in fact we are so fortunate as to fiscally manage this thing properly and find out that at the end of completion of construction, there is still money remaining in the bond, can that money either be used to pay down the bond, or does it have to be used at all?
You know, we sort of broached that topic with our bond counsel in general, as sort of a general question. There are some uses for that money. You could spend it on other public improvements, but it generally can't be used for administration type costs. It could potentially be used to pay off a portion of the bonds. But in my discussions with Nikki, I'm guessing that based on the construction cost estimate you have from 2 years ago now, I think, and the fact we've been discussing a seismic study, I'm guessing that money's all going to be spent. But if it's not, there are ways to use it.
Okay, and then lastly, with regards to control of the line items of the budget that we ultimately come up with for hard construction, how are we going to handle things like change orders and unforeseens as far as placing limits as to the amount of profit that a contractor would be entitled to for those change orders?
You know, the bond proceeds and the project fund will be held by our fiscal agent, which is U.S. Bank, in order to release funds to the district for reimbursement of expenditures or for direct expenditures. There will need to be some forms signed by Nikki that will allow them to release money. So within your own organization, I can't speak to your construction management program, but in order to release the funds, it will have to be a legitimate expenditure and be approved for each type.
And we can, in fact, the construction management folks, I guess, write a contract that so stipulates that for any change orders to be incurred, we will only pay for material and labor costs plus a not to exceed percentage on top of that for the contractor. We can do that, correct?
Yeah, there's no restriction from our end. We're just going to be focusing on getting you the money. I don't, other than your tax counsel telling you what types of expenditures you can make, they're not going to get into your business about any sort of specific construction management procedures.
Okay, and so when does that right there will come up later on then when we're beginning to develop RFPs and contract proposals, then I guess. Okay, thank you.
Nikki, I don't know if you had anything else to add on that, or?
No, I think you summarized it nicely.
Okay, thanks. Okay, moving on. All right, I just wanted to go over the finance team members. We have selected everyone at this point. Obviously, you're the issuer. We're the municipal advisor. Your bond counsel is Best and Krieger. They are also the disclosure counsel. As bond counsel, when they have that hat on, they are preparing the legal documents for the issuance of the bonds. Disclosure counsel, under that function, they will be preparing the preliminary official statement, which is the offering document that'll be sent out to potential bond buyers. So they're kind of two different functions. Sometimes we have two different firms that will do that on larger issues, but it's perfectly fine to have one firm do both parts, and they do that very well. The underwriter is Hilltop Securities. They will be the ones who are actually selling the bonds. They will also select their own underwriters counsel, and they have done that. It is the firm of Kutak Rock, and we've worked with them before in the past. They hire them, so that's the underwriters counsel works for them directly. The district will not pay for that and didn't really have a say in who it was, although I did confer with them when they suggested who to work with, and it's a firm we've all worked with before, so we're comfortable with that. Special tax consultant is MBS, and obviously you've worked with them in the past, and they will be preparing some of the information that we need to put into the preliminary official statement to show the potential bond buyers, such as the revenues that will be generated by this district, any delinquencies in the past, and just specific information regarding the revenue source for this bond issue, which is, again, just the special taxes.
Doug, how does finance team member group differ from the board of trustees and the CFD?
So that would all fall under the issuer category. Everyone else on this list is really part of a finance team. Of course, the broad term finance team includes the issuer, but specifically the team members that you've hired are in addition to your board and CFD district. So
issuer is in fact the library district then?
That's correct. Yes.
So would it not be appropriate to maybe in parentheses or otherwise so indicate that for somebody who doesn't understand or know what an issuer is?
I'm sorry, you were cutting out there. Can you say again?
Oh, I'm saying, okay, if this presentation is reviewed by the public, which I understand it's an open document, and where it says issuer, should the issuer not be identified there as being the library district, separate from all of these others who are retained counsel to the district?
Oh, certainly. We can add that as well. This was sort of a general list. Yeah. Even though we're giving it to your group, it's sort of a generic list of players.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
Doug, this is Kim. Sorry. So I think what I heard you say is that this team, everyone who's not part of the library district, the fees for them will be paid out of the bond proceeds. Is that true?
That is correct.
All right. So maybe this question's for Nikki. Is there anyone that's part of this process that isn't paid out of bond funds? And I'm thinking like maybe the CFD administrator, but I'm not sure.
Nikki, I can start that if you like. Everyone on this list will be paid from the bond issue. When I mentioned some of the other CFDs that we work on for, say, a brand new housing development, typically on those, because we don't have a history of special tax revenues, we will need an appraisal. In those instances, the appraiser, just as he would in even a home refinance, gets paid up front. You can reimburse yourself from the bond proceeds later on, but that would be the only player that I'm aware of that would need money ahead of the bond closing. In this case, we do not need an appraisal because we have an established district with homes that are already in the ground and are already paying taxes. So we don't need the appraisal. We just use the assessed value that the county gives us for the whole district. So,
yeah, the only other one that comes to mind for me is our CFD administration firm. But that would be down the road. So like the special tax consultant is NBS that you see on this list here, and they're going to serve in the capacity of CFD administration as well, which down the road will be built into the general fund. But the work that they're doing related to bond issuance will come out of the bond proceeds.
Great, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I've listed some of the basic bond issuance procedures. Initial steps: select the finance team members. We've already done that for your group. We are on to the second bullet point now in your process. Bond counsel has prepared an initial draft resolution and fiscal agent agreement. There will be some other bond documents that come as well. One of those will be a continuing disclosure agreement, and it'll describe the district's ongoing annual obligation to provide updated information to bond buyers. Typically, I think BB&K does this. I know some bond counsel firms do. When they prepare the preliminary official statement, they will include the continuing disclosure agreement as an attachment to that. So I think since we haven't seen the continuing disclosure agreement yet, I'm assuming it's going to be part of the preliminary official statement, which we expect next week on our schedule. So this week, we're expecting some tables and data from our special tax consultant. And then next week, that information will be put into a draft preliminary official statement that we can all take a look at. After that, we will solicit a bond rating and bond insurance. So bond rating, typically we will go to Standard & Poor's. They're sort of the big player here in California. And once we have a bond rating, we will take a look and see if bond insurance makes sense. It's a function that, depending on market rates, we either pay for or we don't. If it makes sense to lower the interest rate and we think it makes sense to have the bond insurance on there, we will run the numbers and make a recommendation on that. We'll work with Hilltop Securities on that, and they can let us know if in this market they think the bond insurance would be worthwhile. But we definitely will get a bond rating. So the bonds can be sold just with the rating, or they can be sold with the rating and bond insurance. In parentheses, we said the bond insurance would only be for fully developed CFDs, and that's true. So the other types of CFDs I mentioned for brand new developments, we typically can't get a bond rating or insurance for those types of bonds because the districts are so new. They haven't even built the homes yet. But in this case, we can and we will. After we have the bond rating and the bond insurance, we will have a final set of documents that will go to your board. That'll include fiscal agent agreement, bond purchase contract, the preliminary and final official statements, and the continuing disclosure agreements. After the board approves the documents, we move on to actually selling the bonds. We will work with Hilltop to assess the market. We will pick a couple days in the future after we settle with them on the terms of the deal. As far as the length, we're talking about a 30-year issue at this point, but we'll nail that down with them. We'll talk about call provisions. Typically, they allow buyers 10 years before the bonds can be called out. So we'll negotiate all those terms. And then over a period of 2 days, we will actually go to the market and propose rates. And then they will go out and sell the bonds based on the proposed interest rates. Once we have the orders from them at set rates, we will have them sign a bond purchase contract. And then we'll set a date for the closing of the bond issue, which is typically 2 weeks after the pricing. So at this point, we're talking about pricing the week of October 11th. And then closing and the distribution of proceeds would be the week of October 25th.
Doug Rushmore here. Just a quick question on the actual negotiated price once you're ready to go to market. Is this the type of bond issuance that could be a private placement, or you just think this is going to go on the open market?
Probably not a private placement candidate due to the term. The banks that would buy these, instead of selling it to individual investors, there are instances where a bank will just buy the whole bond issue, and that's what we're talking about, a private placement. They like to have terms less than 20 years.
I see.
Also, they are best in a slot where you've got issues under 10 million. That's kind of their sweet spot. So we use private placement structures for refunding bonds typically, because by the time your call period of 10 years is up, let's say 10 years from now, we come back and rates are in a favorable spot, we can refund the bonds perhaps through a private placement but for the initial issuance, we're looking at a public sale.
Right, and thank you for that. And the other thing was, I'm still trying to figure out on this process where we would actually then, if we're going to go in the open market, which we have discussed, is when we would actually solicit residents of Altadena for potentially purchasing those bonds.
Right, and we did talk about that, and Hilltop is aware of that. So we will set up a program with them well before the pricing date that will include residents' participation.
Thank you, Doug.
Doug, once the bonds have been sold, that block of money unspent, can it gain interest?
So you won't actually have the proceeds until the closing date. So after the closing date, and we did talk with Nikki about this, we will take a look at construction investment agreements. And there are firms out there that will allow you to, will give you an investment contract. And they are aware that you're going to use it for construction proceeds, so you can draw down on the money. Typically, you'll give them a schedule, they'll develop a rate, and those are running anywhere from 1.5% to 2% right now. So yes, on $24 million, certainly it'll make sense to get even 1.5% or 2% while you're drawing down the money.
Great. Okay, so that can happen, and all of those transactions will be in U.S. funds, no Bitcoins, right?
That's true. Yes, no one's ever talked about Bitcoin with our bonds yet, so that's good.
I'm afraid that's on the horizon. Then that's kind of
Yeah,
scary.
I think some other generation can deal with that, but we haven't gone there yet.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Doug, I've got a quick question too about the bond issuing. How many bond issuing events do we expect in this process? Is it just one massive issuance of bonds, or are we going to divide this up over the years?
So are you talking about the purchasers, or?
I'm talking about actually, yeah, the purchasing opportunities for people. Do we release $12 million in bonds and then we get another 12 later on, or is there talk about how that rhythm works?
There's the underwriters have a lot of restrictions on them these days as to how they organize the sale. So we're going to have to talk about how we incorporate the residents' desires with other typical bond buyers, such as firms like Fidelity and firms like that that may also buy a big chunk of the bonds. So it'll all be released under one bond sale. We can't really have two separate sales.
Okay.
So it'll be, we'll try to give preference to the residents. I think we're going to get the word out to them. If they're interested, then they can get orders in early, but the actual legal order period will all be during one time period.
Okay, thanks.
And Doug, again, remind me, so the decision, remind me of the amount that we're going forward with?
So according to your approved documents, we can issue up to $24 million par amount of bonds. Typically, you would subtract from that the cost of issuance. Perhaps we'll need a reserve fund to set aside with the fiscal agent, and that's usually a year's worth of debt service. So normally you would expect to get somewhat less than your 24 million. Maybe it's 22.5 million or something. A reserve fund will eat up a big portion of that. We'll have our costs as well. However, currently the underwriters tell us that bonds are selling for a premium. This generates additional proceeds. So it's likely that our proceeds amount, the actual construction fund you have, will be very close to 24 million. So it's a good time to issue bonds. The premium structure has to do with market sentiment. If you're a bond buyer right now, you're concerned that rates are so low, which is great for you as the issuer, but the bond buyer looks at that and says, oh my gosh, I'm going to buy these bonds and they're going to have a coupon rate of 2 or 3% or 3.5%, depending on whatever term I've selected. If I want to sell them in the future, that's a pretty low coupon rate. So what the underwriter does is they change the coupon rate to 4 or 5%. And because that's higher than what the current market is, the buyers pay a premium. And that premium goes to you as the issuer. So long story short, it's likely we'll have a construction fund of 24 million. in this type of market that we have right now.
And my question is really more, have the trustees of the library, do they need to have a formal decision that they want to issue that amount? Again, when the voters voted on this, the document said, well, there's 3 different versions of the amount of construction we can do, and a minimum one, a everything we need one, and then a high end everything in the kitchen sink. And I was just wondering, is there a point where the trustees have kind of said, here's our official decision of what we need?
I haven't heard that specifically, but working with Nikki, we have been assuming we're going to issue the whole amount, but I'll let Nikki chime in on that.
Well, and I'm also really asking the trustees themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so right now we're working with Racklin Partners as our capital project management firm. We meet with them every Monday with the ad hoc facilities committee. Part of our work on that side of things right now has been issuing an RFP to do a tier 3 seismic study, which was recommended when ARG did their assessment in 2020, beginning of 2020, as well as bringing on a firm to do a hazardous materials study. And we want to do that ahead of this bond issuance process to know what we're talking about in terms of cost. So, I'm sure all of you are well aware that construction costs have gone up substantially in the last year to 2. So not only are we wanting to have those numbers before we take the full amount, or like whatever amount we're going to take forward for bond issuance, but also have the other cost estimating that Racklin is doing with us. So we have a good sense of what it's going to cost to actually do both buildings. And it's really looking like it's leaning towards like the full 24 million, because like 1.5 to 2 million is just the administration costs of the bond issuance as well. So we're really looking at closer to probably 22 as an actual full budget, for both hard and soft costs for both buildings. But again,
I'm kind of asking about the process. Is there, does the Board of Trustees of the library weigh in and say, now that we've looked at all the different options, there were 3, but now we've had these 2 additional things we need to do and prices have moved. We are officially saying, or is
Kim,
it part of this?
Kim, as Nikki's saying, the board is going to wait for the analysis of the tier 3 as well as any kind of other type of contamination or soil remediation necessary. And based on those 2 costs, coupled with then also the community events, which will develop the prioritization of the must-haves versus the nice-haves, then that'll be brought back before the board to make the final decision as to what the must-haves and what the nice-haves are, also factoring in the cost to be able to pull this all together along with the services that we're paying for, as well as, remember, reimbursing the district for things that it's already incurred prior to the issuance of said bonds. And furthermore, there's been discussions about the size of the bond issuance. We initially talked about 2 issuances perhaps, but it appeared, I believe we'd all agreed, to probably be codified once more, that it would be just 1 issuance, because of the time frame that we would have to actually spend the proceeds. It certainly would be within the framework of what we need to do as far as getting the work done, so we'd be able to honor that time frame requirement, but also then reduce administrative costs.
Mm-hmm.
So to your process question, we will see it again.
So maybe that's on the prior slide to this one. So where number 2 said legislative body adopts resolutions.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of the phase that I was just asking about. Okay, that's what I want. I just kind of wanted to understand where that is the part where it's, we've made this decision kind of on the scope and all the pieces we need and how many issuances we want to do, et cetera, and that's all in number 2. Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah, so
Doug,
we're gonna take this same presentation to the full board this month, and then September, we'll come back to the CFD committee with what we've gathered through the whole process with the cost estimating and the studies that are being done. And then the resolutions and all of the final paperwork will be going to the full board in the end of September. So yeah, definitely several levels of oversight for sure.
Doug, with
Yes.
regards to disclosure in the in the proposal when it goes out to the bond purchasers. Will we not, in fact, have a hard and fast description of the work that is going to be done with the proceeds?
Yes, typically it will be a list of items that are approved for expenditure. Sometimes it'll have dollar amounts. If we have them available, great, but we will certainly describe the improvements that are planned. If we have some dollar amounts we can use, we might plug those in. Usually we will show a list that's over and above the amount we're issuing, just to show bond buyers that it has plenty of places to go. So yes, there will be some type of a list or description of the expenditures.
Okay,
It's
but it
usually,
won't be,
I was just gonna say, it's usually broad. It allows you to make changes down the road. We don't want to tie your hands with that description, but we want to let the bond buyers know generally what it is you're going to be doing.
yeah, but we also don't want it to be so wishy-washy that it depends is in there.
Sure.
We're
Sure.
dealing with one facility, one building. We know what the age of the building is, what the condition of the building is. And based upon the finance committee making a determination of whether we're going to go with priority 1, 2, or 3, or a combination of them, that will in fact be determined, as opposed to be saying, okay, give us the money and we'll figure out afterward what we're going to do with it. Right? Good.
And I was going to mention too, under step 2 here, where we're getting the actual approval of the documents, typically bond counsel will have language that says the issuance is approved for not to exceed $24 million of bonds. So they will, allow for changes. Doesn't mean that you can't issue $20 million of bonds when we get to pricing, but the approval documents will most likely say not to exceed 24 million, because that's what your authority is. And it would allow, if you decide all of a sudden to issue 2 series, as long as it doesn't exceed the 24 million, in other words, it'll allow for options. When we get down to back to pricing, up to the day of pricing, we can change the par amount. So we have, according to our current schedule, you would have until the second week of October to let the team know, oh, you know what, we only need $20 million of proceeds now, and we can change up to that point. Or if it's not determined and we're still waiting for a major seismic study or something that's could swing things either way, we could push this out a couple weeks. Interest rates will go up at some point, so we're going to keep an eye on that. But this is a preliminary schedule right now, so it can be changed around a bit.
Right. But as far as the finance committee at this point, using $24 million as a hope for amount to be available to spend, if we back out of that, then things like soft costs, things like consulting fees and all of that, we're going to come up with a hard number for brick and mortar, if you will, that's going to go into the facility, allowing for a set aside for change orders or anything like that that may come along. And so that we may know in reality that we're looking at, let's just say, I'll pull a number out of my hat. Let's say $16 million is hard costs. And the other $8 million that were there is then available for expenditures for the various soft costs that are associated with this and the unknowns and the unforeseens that may come out as a result of the findings of hazard analysis, asbestos, and things like that. Correct?
Yes.
Good. Okay.
Okay, we talked about the pricing, the closing. After the pricing, there's a 2-week period where the bond counsel will put together the final documents. There will be a package delivered to Nikki, and the board chairman and Nikki will sign a lot of documents. Once we have all the documents ready to go and we're ready to close, the mechanics of it are the underwriter will wire the total issue purchase price to the fiscal agent. Then the bonds will be released to the actual bond buyers that put in the bond orders. And the net proceeds will then be available to use for your project. Again, we're going to have the fiscal agent hold that project fund. And so when you're ready to draw down on it, there will be some forms that will need to be signed for them to release those funds. After the bonds are issued, part of the CFD administrator's job will do an annual calculation of what the special tax amount should be. And it'll have several components, not just the debt service payment amount for that year, but also administration expenses. And they will also be keeping track of delinquencies. If they see there's a delinquency problem, usually meaning over 5%, then they will make allowances for that in their calculations of the next year's special tax requirement. They also have some annual reporting duties. One report goes to a state agency, CDAC, which is the California Debt and Investment Advisory Commission. They sort of keep track of all bonds issued in the state, par amounts, reserve funds, and they do that so they can see if any issues are heading to trouble. If you tell them all of a sudden you've had to use your reserve fund for a bond payment, that'll certainly warrant some conversations with them. Continuing disclosure reports, we talked a little bit about. These are annual reports for the benefit of the bond buyers and anyone in the public. They're put on a central disclosure website that anyone can go to. And it's annual information such as the total assessed value of the district area, the delinquencies as far as a percentage of the requirements, and just general information about the district. It's updated each year. Arbitrage calculations, haven't had to deal with those for quite a while. This is 20, 30 years ago when bonds were issued and interest rates were high. Some issuers would overissue and invest the bonds at high interest rates, and that hasn't been a problem for quite a while. But as rates go back up again, there is a provision, the IRS will keep an eye on this, and you have to do a calculation every 5 years for them that says if you're holding that money and you still haven't spent some, they want to know what you've got it invested at. It can't be invested at anything higher than your bond yield. So, they've allowed you to issue bonds on a tax-exempt basis for a public purpose. If you're making money off of holding the money, that's an issue, and you'll have to give some of those earnings back to them. So that's what the arbitrage calculation is all about.
Doug, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm having some trouble with my microphone, and I just wanted to, I hate to go backwards, but do you have just a little explanation of the delinquency reserve and exactly what that is?
And Terry, I'm having trouble. Did you tell me again?
About the delinquency reserve.
Oh, okay. This is just a calculation that the special tax consultant will take a look at. If delinquencies are an issue, they are allowed to bump up the annual special tax requirement up to the max tax. So there's a maximum tax that's spelled out in your rate and method. Typically, depending on the bond payments, the annual payments that are paid by the owners in the district will be less than a max tax, but the administrator has authority to bump that up a bit up to the max tax amount if they need to. And the only reason that they would do that is if there perhaps were some type of delinquencies. I don't think, I haven't seen, obviously we haven't seen special tax collection in this district yet, since next year will be the first year. So we'll have to kind of establish a history, but generally when you've got this many owners, delinquency rates aren't a problem. It's where we have small districts in the outlying areas and maybe there's a turn in the economy. We have CFDs that consist of only 150 or 200 homes. And depending on the real estate cycle we're in, sometimes, it gets a little dicey as far as collecting those special taxes. But with a district this broad, with this many residents, I don't anticipate that being a problem.
Okay, thank you.
Question, Ms. Rushmore.
Go ahead, Rush.
Nikki or Doug, is there a cost associated with the county collecting the special tax that we should be aware of, or they just collect taxes irrespective of this, of whether it's a special bond issuance or not, or special tax assessment?
That's a good question. I know LA County typically charges for everything they do, but I'm sure that MBS takes that into account when they do their administration expense calculation each year, whatever that is.
Right, because that's going to go for the life of the bond. So just want to make sure that cost is covered. I'm not quite sure how that is. Nikki, do you have an idea?
Yeah, I know that it's built into our budget as an expense, what we pay LA County to collect the taxes that they do right now. So I would assume it will be the same thing. And yeah, like Doug said, I'm sure NBS will guide that process.
Great, thank you.
Okay, and Doug, on the debt service payment, that is an annual payment made over the course of the life of the bond?
They are actually semi-annual payments. You'll have one interest payment only, and then you'll have 6 months later semi-annual interest plus the principal payment.
Okay.
And what MBS will do is they'll get our debt service schedule once we sell the bonds, and they'll use that to guide them in forming their annual special tax requirement. And again, that's only a portion of it. They'll add other costs on top of that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
All right, we talked about arbitrage calculation, property owner services. I know MBS is aware that the district gets many phone calls, staff does. And so I think MBS is going to be taking some of that load once they're in their official capacity. And, you know, people call and wonder about things, and especially when properties are transferred. So they'll be available to help with those types of calls from folks. This last slide just has sort of a graphic showing the annual reporting requirements that MBS will be taking care of for you. The CDAC report that we talked about that goes to that state agency is due by October 30th of each year. The continuing disclosure reports are typically due in the spring. They're usually 9 months after your fiscal year end. So depending on when your fiscal year ends, they'll be those will set the dates then for the reports for the prior fiscal year. And that'll include audited financials. It'll include the updates on the district details, such as the assessed value and things like that. It'll also include some information about the actual bond issue and the funds that are held by the fiscal agent. So if there's a reserve fund or a balance remaining in the project fund, that information will be included in the disclosure reports as well. And these are the reports, that middle column, that'll be anyone can pull up online, so they're available to the public. Other reports, there's some specific California legislation that's been adopted over the last couple of years, and mainly it's just accountability to make sure that things are being spent correctly and keeping track in case any issues go sideways, based on real estate cycles we've had in the past where, you know, for some smaller districts with brand new homes, some have gone sideways at least for a couple of years. And so this always leads to new legislation with more reports. So MBS will take care of all this for you. And that concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any other questions that you have.
Doug?
Barry, you're on mute. You're on mute.
I'm having trouble with my microphone, I'm sorry. We carry a half a year reserves right now in our balance. Does that change at all with the bond?
So as far as the reserve fund that I was speaking of, this would be specific to the bond issue and would be held by the fiscal agent.
Okay.
So that'll be something separate.
Okay, so it doesn't do anything to change our core accounting with the library itself?
No, it's specific to the bond issue. It's related to a portion, 50% or sometimes 100% of an annual payment on the bond issue.
Okay.
Yeah, the library district is not on the hook for this. It's not liable. It's the taxpayers of Altadena.
Yeah. Good point. The repayment of the bonds, and this will be stated in several different places, is strictly limited to the special taxes.
I had a operational question. So, you know, going through a lot of the papers today, I could see that the director of the library now has a whole lot of other things that they are doing around this whole project. So, Nikki, I just wondered, is this something that is causing you to need additional kind of regular library staff I'm assuming that was something that would be funded out of the regular operating budget.
Yeah, being that we're paying NBS to do the CFD administration work, so a lot of the disclosures and all the reporting that's required out of this, I don't anticipate a much larger load to say. I guess we're going to have to assess as we go. I do think having the CFD committee that we're meeting with regularly is going to keep things on track as well, as we're reporting out on these things, but not that I'm aware of at this point. We'll see. Okay. Any other questions for Doug?
Thank you, Doug. Very, very informative.
Thank you, Doug.
Thank you. It was also helpful to have it in advance of our meeting.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh, and Doug, will that PowerPoint remain on the website?
Nikki is not, I see Nikki nodding her head. Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, it's part of this board package or the CFD committee package, and we'll stay on there on the meeting materials.
Okay.
And actually, Diego, maybe we should put it on our building projects page. We could do that as well for people that are checking out that page of the website too. It's a good idea.
Good.
Okay.
Okay, moving on, then we don't have any unfinished business in the meeting. And we're on to new business, which is a review of the resolution to adopt a debt policy and disclosure and tax policies, which will be presented to the board at our next meeting on the 25th, I believe.
23rd, yeah.
23rd, sorry. So I guess I'd like to open that up to any conversation or observations that we've all made about these documents and take it from there.
I thought maybe we could turn it over to Nora O'Brien, our bond counsel, who's on the call too, and she can kind of just like give us a rough overview of what we're looking at and the requirements that we have to get this established before we're able to go through the bond issuance process. Hi, Nora. I think you're muted.
You're muted.
Sorry, I thought I hit video and unmute. Now can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So there's certain requirements, and because the district hasn't issued debt in the public markets before, there's kind of a fine line between having, it's good to have a policy, but you also want to have a policy that is able to be followed, because you could have, a extensive 100-page policy, but if you don't follow it, that's almost more detrimental than not having one at all. So I think, just to kind of give an overview with what we started with, there is a government code requirement. Not technically a requirement, but Section 8855 of the government code, you have to, when you issue debt, you do a report to CDAC. I believe Doug mentioned CDAC in his presentation. And there is a box that you check that the issuer has adopted a local debt policy and that the proposed debt issuance is in compliance with that policy. So the debt policy that will be considered attached to the resolution for approval by the board at the end of August satisfies the requirements of that Section 8855. So the specific requirements of the local debt policy are set forth in bullet points in the statute, and it goes over the purposes for which debt proceeds may be used, the types of debt that may be issued, the relationship of the debt to and integration with the library district's capital improvement program, policy goals related to the district's planning goals and objectives, and then internal control procedures that the district will implement to make sure that debt proceeds are directed towards their intended use. So that debt policy that is attached, I believe that the CFD committee received drafts of the resolution, and then attached to the resolution as Exhibit A is the debt policy. And it is meant to be pretty straightforward and just really clearly set out the different requirements to be in a local debt policy under that government code section 8855. And I'm happy to answer any questions on that policy that anyone had, or I did notice that there's still brackets in section 4 that I think we can go ahead and remove when we take that to the board and later this month.
Nora, if I may,
Yes.
on page 28, it covers definitions. And I'm wondering why it is that the oversight committee is not listed in the definitions. And shouldn't it be?
So that the policy on, so that there's two different, well, technically 3 different policies that are being approved per the resolution. There's the debt policy that's meant to comply with section 8855 of the government code. And then there's a disclosure and tax policies and procedures that are meant to establish policies and procedures relating to federal and tax law on the issuance of debt. So I'm happy to add the oversight committee to the extent the oversight committee will be involved in the disclosure process.
Well, not only in the disclosure process, but if I understand correctly, our role is kind of as an overseer, a check and balance of the processes and procedures that are taking place, which you had just mentioned. It's an internal control that we have. And I think they need to know that we do have in place this internal control so that it reinforces the checks and balances that we've got in place.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. That's a good comment, and I can work with Nikki to get that incorporated in the draft that goes out to the board later this month.
Okay, and then in page 23, my concern there was that we don't have any language in there with regards to control of, I guess, cost overruns and stuff like that. How can we better indicate that we have in place procedures that are going to limit the potential costs incurred with regards to change orders that are eventually going to occur on the project?
So I'm not sure that would necessarily be something that would be in a debt policy. That would be more of something, I believe, Nikki can jump in, but I think that would be something that would be with the contractors that are working for you. This section 2 of the debt policy specifically just covers the purposes for which debt proceeds may be used. So it wouldn't really relate to change orders for the construction.
Understood. Okay, take that off the table and look at page 25, where we talk about the bond proceeds. And we covered that a little bit earlier with regards to what if we don't need to expend all of the proceeds based on the budget that we create. Can it then in turn be used for something other than the originally intended purpose? That is either to pay down the debt or not to have to expend. Well, I guess once we put the 24 million out and we've got it sitting in the bank somewhere, the difference between the final hard cost of the project and what's remaining, that money can be used for what?
So it can be used for authorized facilities and then all the soft costs associated with that, preliminary expenses that were authorized under the formation documents. So the projects to be done at the 2 library branches that were authorized in formation, authorized to be used in formation of the CFD. And before you go to issue tax exempt bonds, you have to have a reasonable expectation that 85% of the proceeds will be able to be spent within the first 3 years. So you wouldn't, if there weren't projects for the 24 million that you didn't envision being able to spend the proceeds within 3 years, you wouldn't issue that amount.
Okay, you brought up an interesting point. We can use this for the main branch, and we can also use it for the satellite branch.
That's
that
correct.
correct?
That was authorized under the formation documents.
But have we done any kind of an accounting at this point as to an anticipated budget for the other branch at this time?
I will let Nikki speak to that. I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, the work that we're doing with Racklin Partners, as well as the architectural and design review that ARG did last year, has estimates for Bob Lucas as well. So,
Okay, so-
where those have pretty much come in generally are between 1.5 to 2 million. for
Okay,
Bob Lucas.
so we're only looking at maybe 10% or 15% of the proceeds then that would be going to that branch, with the bulk of it going to the main branch.
Right, and I think there's other things to consider, like if when we go out for an architect, let's say, do we hire one
Yes.
or two? That might weigh into the amount of money that's spent, like if you hire one versus separate. So
Sure.
you know, again, that could change the soft costs a little bit, but yeah, both are being cost estimated.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
All right.
Go, Kim.
Yeah, I had a
See, Kim using
question
your hand.
on the tax policy on page 1, but let me give you the number here. So it's on
Yes.
page 27. Wait, no.
33 of 35.
Page 1, tax policy. Where it's saying bond documents, it's in the definitions.
Yes.
So it says,
Oh.
it means
Yeah,
document. Okay,
I see that there is some missing language there.
okay, good,
So
good.
that's a good catch, and I will add that. But, you know, I think that what it was supposed to include, it would be a fiscal agent agreement, and then kind of any of the certificates that are executed in connection with the issuance of the bonds, which would include a tax certificate. And that just relates to the rules when you issue tax exempt bonds that you have to comply with, that the district will sign as of the closing date of the bond issuance. So
I wanted to make sure that I
Yes.
wasn't.
good,
it felt-
good catch. Including but not
And then-
limited to everything.
And then you pointed out the highlighted language in section 4 of the first document. So it talks about the regular maintenance will come from revenues of the parcel tax or services component of this CFD tax. Is there a reason it doesn't say from the other big chunk of regular operating funds, I guess, that still come from the county? Is there a reason they're not included there?
Yeah, and maybe they should be. I can check with Nikki on that. When I was drafting this, I wasn't sure. So that was why it was in brackets there.
Okay, yeah, I mean, it feels like it might make sense to reassure people that maintenance of the facilities, is a key operating expense, and we wouldn't. It's not as though we would stop doing it somehow if this CFD for services was reversible.
Right.
Yeah, so that
Right.
kind of thing. All right, great, thank you.
No problem.
Nora,
Yes.
Rushmore here. On A3 or page 25 of 35, just a quick typo with the very first line at the top. Change should be N versus S, if you're going to be making changes anyway.
I will take you said the first paragraph?
Very first
Oh.
line, change when the change in use was
In
authorized.
use. Got it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, minor. I had a question relative to page 33 or 35, a second line to ensure that any bonds that no longer qualify for tax exempt status are identified and remediated. So, I mean, is this something wherein the board that the library district inadvertently utilized funds for inappropriate matter, and then the IRS has deemed them no longer taxable? Is that what we're saying?
I mean, yes, I think Doug and I were talking this through with Nikki when we had our call to go over this. it's not something that I think the library district has a lot to worry about, but it would be, if I think we use the example, if they decided to lease out a small portion of the library to Starbucks and they were making money on that specific area of this library that was partially financed with tax exempt bonds.
So in that strange event that we did that, and Nikki's making hand over fist dollars, with Starbucks in there,
paying off debt service with the lease
exactly. Realize she's in the wrong business. So but would that mean the entire $24 million would be deemed non-taxable? What would that mean to us? And not that we have any concerns, but since the language is in there, I'm kind of curious what the ramifications would be if, in fact, there was $100,000 deemed that that we spent was not in compliance with. What does that trigger mean?
So there are rules for, I think, you'd call that like bad use. So you are allowed a certain amount, and there's a private activity, tests. So I would defer to our tax counsel. We have a partner here that specializes in this, so he's the expert. But generally speaking, if it was a small amount, it wouldn't even make the whole bond issue, any part of the bond issue, taxable. And the purpose for this tax policy is to make sure that there are checks and balances and someone's looking at this regularly, so that if there is an issue, it's caught at the front end, rather than where you've been collecting lease payments from Starbucks for 10 years, and then all of a sudden it becomes a big issue where if you've only collected 5 months of lease payments, someone notices it, you can catch it right away, and then it wouldn't be an issue at all.
Right. Well, just like arbitrage is not going to be an issue, but you have to have the language in there for the rebate calculation.
Right. And you do need to do the calculation. So it's, even though right now it's something that we laugh about, at some point it might become an issue again.
Right. And I don't know, this is a question for you or maybe Nikki, but this is on going backwards 30 or 35. And this goes to the actual review for accuracy and completion, that would the Roman numeral triple I. This is on the actual disclosure. The working group will be working on the disclosure. It'll wind its way through the actual board, but the final approval, I guess I'm sorry, Roman numeral 4, the final approval. So the board of trustees shall approve a substantial final form of the preliminary official statement. The disclosure working group and shall approve the preliminary and final official statement. So I was kind of curious as to why the board wouldn't approve, the board trustees would not approve the official final statement. Was there some reason why the board trustees would be included?
Yeah, so typically how the resolution of issuance will be set out is that the board, just like all the other documents, they'll approve in substantially final form, and they'll authorize, authorized officers of the district to make any revisions or amendment, just because what we present to you at the end of September, if we are going by the current schedule, if you approved just that document without the ability to make any changes, that would really tie our hands. There's always little things that come up. In fact, an hour before you're going to post the preliminary official statement, and you want to have the ability to make that document flexible. And so that is why the form of preliminary official statement is approved, and then any changes are delegated to in this case, based on this policy, the district director working with BBK as disclosure counsel and the municipal advisor in advisory capacities to make those changes. And then in terms of making the preliminary official statement final, so the preliminary official statement will be final except for what's called permitted omissions under 15 C212. And then once the deal prices, all that information will be filled in, and then the final official statement will be created. And that has to be posted within, I think it is 7 business days of entering into a contract. The underwriter has to post that official statement. So we wouldn't have time to bring that final official statement back to the board for approval to meet the requirements under 15 C212.
I had a feeling it was going to be your response, but I just wanted to ask just so that if anyone was
No.
watching, we're
And
asking for
honestly, these are really, really good questions, because it's nice. It's better to have people really engaged in this process. So all these questions are appreciated.
But to
Well,
Rush,
on that note, I have one more question, and I'll turn it over. Is it on this, Kim, or is it something else?
no, I was going to say on that point, to your point though, does it make sense for the final to come back to the Board of Trustees for ratification and for good public transparency? I mean, I'm assuming when you talk about posting, you're not necessarily meaning on the library's website, but you see what I mean?
Yeah, so it will be publicly available on the Municipal Securities Rulemaking Board's website on Emma. So I
go there every day.
Sure you do.
So it's kind of there are issuers that post on their website their offering documents. It's I'm not sure that we would, if that is the desire, we just wouldn't want to put it out there like this, this was the most, you don't want to have this perceived notion of having everything up to date all the time. So if you have, to the extent you have your documents all on the website, if there's something in there that wasn't the most up to date, it's just not that it can't be done. And some of our clients do put their official statements on their website, but it's not something that we had in this policy.
Well, on that note, as far as posting, I did want to have one last comment, and that was on the bottom of page 32, and it's something similar to, post action, if you will, waiver of procedures, which gives the officers and employees the charged with the disclosure policy that they may deviate or depart from the disclosure policy when the disclosure officer in good faith determined that such departure is in the best interest of the district and consistent with the duties of the district under the federal and state securities laws. I was just one of those things of, if there is a deviation, I think it'd be important to have at least a public communication that there was a deviation, not suggesting anyone's going to do anything incorrectly, but if there is a deviation, we have a set approved policy that's been fully vetted publicly. If there's going to be any sort of deviation from that, I think it'd be for transparency purposes important to disclose that.
Okay, so maybe, any deviation or waiver from these procedures the board would be informed of after the event.
Yes.
I think this really gets to if there is some sort of material event notice that needs to go out and you don't have time to exactly follow these procedures, but you need to get it out. That's what this gets to.
I get it. No, I absolutely get it. I don't want to create a process in which is onerous and administrative burden where you can't, be timely, but, but it should be some, at least disclosure sub post action that these things were done.
Sure.
So
we can add something like that.
Just a paper trail,
Yeah.
So we don't go back 10 years from now wondering, what happened here? How can we do this? Why we do something different?
Right. That sounds good. I will add that.
Thank you, Nora.
Terry, this is Amy. I'm really sorry, but I was under the impression this meeting was going until 4, and I have another commitment where I have to drive to get to it by 5. I'm not sure what to do. I know we have a quorum, but I don't want to mess up I know we have an action item ahead of us. So
that's fine, Amy. I didn't expect things would go this long. I'm sorry for that, but we've got the number that we need to vote.
Okay.
So yeah, certainly feel free to do that. That happens in our regular meetings from time to time. Someone has to leave early or come late. So
okay.
Absolutely no problem.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I really appreciate all the clarifying questions and receiving the documents in advance. So thank you all for the really good work.
Okay.
Thank you, Amy.
Nora, I just had a quick question regarding the sort of time frame for all this, and you might have, I've been struggling a little bit with my connection. when it comes to the preliminary official statement, then that sounds like something that would go directly to the Board of Trustees and bypass this committee, right?
Well, I think Doug probably touched on this a little bit in his presentation, but I think the plan is I've already sent out initial drafts of the fiscal agent agreement and the resolution of issuance. That's the resolution actually approving the issuance of the bonds. And as part of that resolution, it approves the form of the fiscal agent agreement, the substantially final form of the preliminary official statement, and the bond purchase agreement. And I believe the plan is to bring all of that back to the CFD committee at the meeting in September prior to going to the board for approval at the end of September.
Okay, good. I heard you say late September, and we actually meet on the 9th of September. That's our next, or the 8th, actually.
Okay.
Okay,
And the current schedule that Doug sent out, and I actually did just get the initial draft of the special tax tables today for the POS, but that's what we call the preliminary official statement. That calls for the initial draft going out sometime next week. It will probably be towards the end of next week because it does take a lot to get that document into good shape. But so we'll probably be through a draft or two by the time the CFD committee meets on the 9th of September.
Okay, thank you. And while, in the spirit of accuracy too, I've got a little typo I wanted to type out.
Yes.
That'll never get picked up. And it's in that first paragraph on page number 25 of 35. At the bottom, it says deviations from the indented use of debt proceeds. So you won't pick that one up. I just wanted to point it out.
Hold on, let me see. Intended. Got it. Thank you. Any typos are very much appreciated because when you work in these documents, it's hard to find them after a while. And if anyone sees any, after the meeting, if for some reason they're studying this document late at night, feel free to send them to Nikki and she can get them over to me, or you could just email me directly.
Okay. Are there any more questions from the members? And Nikki, I'm wondering if now's a time to go ahead and initiate a vote on this.
Yeah, I think you could ask for a motion.
Okay.
I'll move.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded to approve these documents regarding the Community Facilities District. So I will take a roll call. Member Cervantes.
Aye.
Member Vitale. Jim, I'll need you to unmute so that we can hear you for the recording. You're on.
Yo,
there
we go.
And, Member Kenny,
Yes.
and that's a yes for me as well. So thank you, everybody. Nikki, is there anything else that you'd like to go over, or in conclusion?
No, I don't think so. I just wanted to thank everyone for being so very, very thorough in reviewing all of this ahead of time. I really think we had some good questions. This will be a good video to go back and watch,
Yeah.
Information.
Jim, I know you wanted to talk about something offline, and I'm wondering.
No, we've already covered all three of the points that I was concerned about, and they've been addressed, so I'm good.
Okay, great. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, everybody. I appreciate you
Sure.
being here, and if I could get a motion to adjourn.
I motion to adjourn.
Okay. And are there any objections? All right, so we stand adjourned at 4:21 p.m. Thank you, everybody, so much. We really appreciate it. Doug, thanks for that great presentation. The same with you, Nora. We appreciate your involvement.
Yeah.
Good
Thank
meeting.
you all.
Good meeting.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Welcome.
Bye-bye.
Bye.